This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In Colorado, Denver Post reporter Elizabeth Hernandez is covering education and a little bit of everything else. That's a challenge in a state with no shortage of school-related stories, and at a newspaper where human capital is in short supply. I wanted to find out more about how she's balancing those obligations, and she joins us today. Elizabeth, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
When you tell people you cover education in Colorado and they ask you what that's like, what do you tell them?
There's never a shortage of news here in Colorado, whether that be education or not. And when people ask me what it's like covering education, it's so interesting because I am not typically the education reporter. So I kind of get to do a little bit of everything from preschool through higher ed. And there's no shortage. I mean, there's really interesting school funding issues, there's school choice, there's equity gaps and diverse students and teachers. So I love figuring out what's the story of the day, the story of the week, the month, and what bigger projects should we be looking at.
Well, let's talk about one of the big stories for you of the past couple of months, and that was the Denver teachers' strike. There have been a wave of those across the country in the past year. This one was relatively short compared to some places like Oklahoma and West Virginia. But tell us about it. How many days were they out of the classroom?
Well, the strike itself, teachers were out of the classroom for about 3 days. The strike ended on the dawn of the fourth day, and some teachers went back and some didn't. But while that may have been shorter than some other ones, it felt very long because there were months, almost a year of negotiations before then. And in Colorado, which I know is different from some other places, the bargaining sessions are public. So where some of those things happen behind closed doors in other places, they're just open for reporters and for the community to come in. So I think watching those over, a course of months really had everyone kind of emotionally drained and exhausted by the time the strike actually happened.
What did you learn from watching those bargaining sessions?
It was really interesting to watch. They would last 12 hours, 14 hours, and after school, teachers would start coming, and they would just be packed and rowdy and chanting. And you could tell sometimes when the Teachers Union, Denver Classroom Teachers Association, and Denver Public School District were saying things almost directed toward the media or trying to get a reaction out of people in the room. It was almost sort of like strategic negotiations that you had to consider. People are watching these, and what we say can be put on a headline the next day or can really inflame people's feelings about things. It was really an experience every day to see what was going to happen.
It sounds incredible, and I think we should emphasize to people that these negotiations weren't happening inside a glass box. I mean, these were living, breathing people who were taking in the energy of the people around them, and in that way, it's a little bit like live theater.
It was, and at one point, the words political theater were used to describe what was happening, and people were really upset about that because the teachers were saying, this isn't theater, this is my life, and this is impacting me, and we don't think of it as a play or something. This is how we're going to live, and these wages will affect my family and all of these things. So while it was at some points interesting to watch it in the sense of something playing out before you, we always tried to remember that these are impacting real people's lives.
I thought you took a smart approach, though, to explaining to readers that while the state's accountability laws require making that negotiation process transparent, the caucuses between the two sides are private. Explain to us how they went about circumventing the public spectacle there.
So at some points, they could go back and caucus in private. The teachers union and the district could go into separate rooms that were not public. We were usually in either the library or a district school building. So they would go away and you never really knew when they would come back. Usually a proposal would be presented and they would kind of argue or talk about it for a little while and then say, okay, we're going to go caucus and figure out our counter proposal or figure out, how we feel about this. And they could be gone for 20 minutes to that last bargaining session before the strike ended. It was 10 hours overnight. And so we were there, I think it was 8 p.m. until 6 a.m. or something like that. Just no one knew when they would come back. So it was a lot of waiting, a lot of anxiety. And so many people just kept saying, what is going on, including myself and some of the reporters who were down there in the library basement at 4 a.m. being like, are they coming back or not?
It had to be exhausting. I'm wondering, though, this was Denver's first teacher strike in 25 years. Is it being considered a success? Did they get more than they would have gotten if they hadn't walked out?
I think that both sides said it was a success, both kind of praised the process and said that they were happy with the results. I think it's different for individual teachers. I know that some people were not so happy and some teachers were really happy. But overall, I think that it showed the unity that teachers have. And I heard from many people that they felt more unified and that they really needed this momentum to carry them through the rest of the year to get this sort of attention and realize the issues going on in their lives and their professional lives.
I think you've made a good point here that these strikes, when they do happen, usually aren't a huge surprise. There's often a buildup that's coming, whether weeks or months of negotiations beforehand. What advice do you have for an education reporter who may be covering labor issues in their own district, whether or not a strike might be looming on the horizon?
So for me, I was just kind of thrown in when it happened. So I don't think I had the background that some reporters might have here, but I actually thought that that was sort of helpful in some areas in that I was just coming at it like a reader might. Like, I need to know very basic issues and I don't have the background here. So I'm going to need people to break this down for me very clearly. What do both sides want? What is the history here? A lot of this was about relationships. So much of the contract negotiations was about years of distrust between the teachers union and the district. So that was sort of interesting dynamic to pick up on and hear a lot of people talk about. So I think it's important to, of course, follow sort of the money aspect. What is the differences between the plan? What do people want? But also remember that these are human beings in your community and remember the human impact of the story and how that's impacting teachers and district administrators and everyone involved.
We're talking with Elizabeth Hernandez of the Denver Post about covering education in the Rocky Mountain state. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And don't forget to take a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us grow. Elizabeth, I want to turn to another story, which to me feels in some ways like very much a Colorado story. And that's how school districts are handling issues related to school safety and specifically social media threats. Bring us up to speed, but let's start with what is the Safe to Tell network?
That's a network that came out of the Columbine shooting. There was a movement to figure out what can people do about this as police, as school districts, as parents, as students to prevent something like that from ever happening again. So that's an anonymous sort of hotline. I think you can also email and send in messages now. It's sort of been updated throughout the years. Students or teachers or really anyone in the community can send in school safety tips. It can be a range of things, but someone in Safe to Tell looks over those and addresses them. And it's a really praised program. It's prevented a lot of bad intentions from coming to fruition. So it's a program that a lot of states look at. And I know it's very praised here in Colorado.
And it's been flooded recently, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. And I don't know if that's necessarily new, but I do know that when things like school shootings happen outside of Columbine, when they happen in the national climate as they do, they tend to get more responses the days after that as students are scared by them or there are kind of copycat situations. And recently in Colorado, the social media threats via Snapchat or Facebook or Twitter have been just in proliferation. I mean, school districts and police departments are really having a difficult time with resources responding to all of these threats, and they can't not respond to them, I was told, because obviously it's too important. And imagine if they didn't take one seriously and that ended up being something that was very serious. So it's a problem here.
And there's actually a law in Colorado that school districts can use to charge people who make these kinds of threats. What do you know about how they're cracking down on this?
So I know that the law is intended to take into account students who disrupt a school day, is how it's sort of phrased. And in some cases, this can be a student sends a picture of a gun, or it could be even a toy gun to a friend, thinking that it's a funny joke. Obviously, it's not. And, with things like Snapchat, someone can see this and not know this person and maybe not understand what was intended to be funny. And it can just spiral into a rumor of someone's brought a gun to school today or someone is bringing a gun to school tomorrow. And this can really disrupt the school day. So I know that that is a law that police are using now to crack down on this. And I think school districts handle it differently, but I know that it is taken very seriously, and it definitely disrupts the school day when police officers and school security have to come in and search people and question people all over what could have been a really dumb, quote, joke, or it could have been serious. You never know until you investigate.
Well, we're talking about social media. You use it to great effect. You're very active on Twitter. You have a lot of followers, but you also use it as a reporting tool. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing in terms of engagement.
I use Twitter a lot in my reporting. Not only do I sort of use it as my notebook when I'm out covering something at a scene, like during the teacher strikes, I used it pretty frequently as a notebook, which was helpful to my editor who could just kind of pull things into a story we had. But I also use it to engage with readers. And I think that that's really important, particularly for a print reporter like me, because I'm not your local news anchor who you see every day at 6 p.m. while you're eating dinner or whatever. You might not know anything about me, you just see my byline. And I think that that distrust comes from not knowing who you're talking to or who you're reading. So I really enjoy engaging with my community, sharing little pieces about what I'm working on, or even little pieces about my life. I tweet about my cat Levi all the time, and people seem to enjoy that. But yeah, I really use it as a tool of asking people what I should be covering, or if I need a source, if I need a teacher or a student or a principal or whatever. I often use Twitter to put out a call for that. And now that I've sort of developed a community around me, people respond to that, which is really great.
The Denver Post is owned by Alden Global Capital. That's a hedge fund. There were some steep newsroom cuts last year to the Denver Post and major layoffs. The editorial staff has been pretty outspoken, pushing back on how the paper is being managed, and you've spoken up as well. Was it a difficult decision for you to become so vocal publicly about the newsroom issues?
At some point, I kind of figured I don't really have a choice here. I think that this is too important, and my job is to let our community know what's going on. And this is something going on in their communities. Local news is being decimated across the country, and not just here in Denver, but I can share my personal perspective about how that's impacting me and impacting my colleagues in our newspaper. And it was sort of like, if I don't tell my story and the story of our newspaper, I don't know how much longer I'll be able to tell other people's stories in the community. I just think it's too important of an issue. And we normally aren't advocates for our issues. We report on them. And this was just one thing that it was like, I don't know if I can do my job any longer if I don't inform the community about what's going on here.
Was it strange to be in the protesters' shoes?
It was very strange. After covering so many protests, I went to New York over the summer with some of my colleagues and some other Alden-owned papers across the country, and we went and protested outside of their headquarters. And it was so strange, and it felt really surreal because other reporters were there, the New York Times and other people were there covering us. It was just so strange to kind of see that and have people coming up to me and asking me questions and taking pictures and that kind of thing. It felt very surreal.
Has going through this experience changed you at all? Has it impacted the way you do your job?
What has definitely changed me in this experience is, and I really feel for my sources so much more now than I ever knew to, because anytime a newspaper goes through something in the country now, people call me as like the reaction girl of like, how do you feel? And how's local news? And, that can be really exhausting. It's been about a year since this has all happened. And people always, are contacting me about things that aren't happening at my paper, or how do you feel about this paper closing or whatever. And I know that we have sources who we do similar things to when we're like, oh, this person, is the education person. We should call them for reaction. And sometimes it's just exhausting, and I just want to do my job, and I don't want to be the face of like the downfall of local news. And it has definitely opened my eyes, and I hope made me a more compassionate reporter.
Well, we don't want to leave the Denver Post on a negative note. We want to point out some good news, as you mentioned at the top of the program, that you've hired a new K-12 education reporter, which means you're going to move over to higher education. What are you looking forward to covering there?
I am so excited. I covered higher education at the Boulder Daily Camera, where I focused on the CU Boulder University, but now I'll be doing statewide stuff. So I'm really excited, and I really enjoy covering higher ed because of my own experience with higher education. I'm a first-generation college student, and coming into school, I just had no idea what I was doing, really. Applying for colleges, doing financial aid. It is a miracle to me that I made it to a newspaper and everything seemingly worked out for me. But just going through those experiences, I think it's so important to really document and report on the things that matter to students and parents while also holding really powerful institutions accountable.
Elizabeth Hernandez is an education reporter and a lot of other things at the Denver Post, and she joined us from her office there. Elizabeth, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
And that wraps up another episode for us. I want to mention that this is episode 201. Yes, we missed our own big anniversary party last week. I apologize. I will buy myself a cupcake and I will take a bite for every one of you. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.